For this last session, the pun is intended in the title, of course. When we say transformative ideas, it's not about a new sensor, not necessarily about a new method of data assimilation, a better resolution. We intend here to try to spark a conversation about deeper transformation, and basically to go beyond the assumption that more knowledge is what we need only. So after all, the critical zone articulate research which in environments with a lot of human dynamics, and this may be put into questions, how they interplay and how we are driven inside and outside science, within institutions, within governments. Otherwise, we might be confined to actually just documenting the symptoms of the change in the critical zone and missing perhaps the underlying causes that are behind the change of habitability that is the theme in critical zone research. And we might be in the end confined to do critical zone gardening. So with this session, we are happy to start now. And actually, just a reminder, there's also a session in the afternoon, so it's not very well obvious in the program, but from 3:30 to 5, there is a reflexive workshop. It's going to be fun and dynamic, I promise. And to open this session, it's really my pleasure to have today Esther Turnhout, who is a professor and chair of the Science and Technology and Society at the University of Twente in the Netherlands. She's an interdisciplinary social scientist within the broad research field of science studies, and I think she will talk about it. And she looks at the interactions and power dynamics between knowledge practices, scientific and non-scientific, around environmental and sustainability issues. She's been contributing to the IPBES reports various times, and she's a former editor-in-chief of Environmental Science and Policy. With this, I leave you the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that really nice introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry I couldn't come earlier because I was teaching. And indeed, we're going to be offering today a little bit of a critical perspective. This is appropriate, I think, given the topic of the conference. Critical means that we need to dig deeper, and that we need to get at the root causes of our current predicaments. And this current predicament is one of polycrisis. And I like this term because it kind of emphasizes that we're not just dealing with environmental change, climate change, biodiversity loss. We are also dealing with growing social inequality, injustices, and these crises are interconnected, not just because they impact on each other, but also because they have common root causes. And to get out of the polycrisis, we need to start addressing these common root causes. But this is not what we're doing. It's become abundantly clear, hopefully for many, that the sustainability we have is not the sustainability we need. And arguably, it's never been that way. From the start, sustainability, particularly in its dominant paradigm of ecological modernization, has worked to protect the current political economic system. So instead of genuine measures that would address these common root causes, we have a proliferation of false stopgap solutions that address symptoms and not causes, and that are not effective, very often unjust, and produce negative trade-offs. Now, to their credit, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services has recognized these limitations when they initiated an assessment of transformative change. I was part of this assessment, and it stands out in terms of its scope and its content. I think as a biodiversity assessment, it's not clearly recognizable for many biodiversity scientists. I think it delivered an important innovation in how we frame the problem of biodiversity loss. So first of all, it offers a definition with different components. where it considers that transformative change requires fundamental shifts in not just what we do, in not just the rules and the institutions that we have, but also in terms of the worldview that underpins and justifies these actions and institutions. And it also focuses on these underlying root causes. And this is the second innovation that the report delivers. So much of biodiversity science and also biodiversity policy has focused most of its attention on what is called direct drivers, particularly land use change, for example. Now, what this assessment has done is offer a comprehensive analysis of what actually drives these drivers. And it has identified 3 underlying root causes. The first is on the level of worldviews, a dominant worldview that is based on the separation between humans and nature, and the associated idea that humans are not just allowed but entitled to control nature. The second root cause is the concentration of power and wealth, recognizing finally that inequality itself is a major driver of environmental degradation, as well as a major factor in the obstruction of more transformative sustainability action. Now, thirdly, a little bit more on the individual level, we see a preference for individual short-term material gains. Now, going back to this dominant worldview, this has been theorized by decolonial thinker Hannibal Cuiano as coloniality modernity. Now, what this concept makes clear is, first of all, this worldview is based on a separation between subjects and objects. Now, subjects are considered capable of knowing and controlling. In colonial times, subjects referred exclusively to white, rich European men, and we have seen slow progress in expanding this. And then, on the other hand, we have the objects, those that are subjected to knowledge and control. Nature and natural resources, but obviously many humans are regularly treated as objects. For example, when they enter their job. A crucial point that Cuiano makes is that this worldview cannot be seen as separate from colonialism and capitalism. They emerge together in response to and as a justification for the violence and oppression that colonialism and capitalism was creating. Now, as you may have started to realize, this modernist worldview, its separations, relations, and values are firmly embedded in how we see science and how we think science should relate to policy and society. Now, one of these most persistent of these values is neutrality, and I will talk a little bit more about particularly this one. So neutrality is not just philosophically unattainable, its pursuit is actually harmful. In this quote, Julia Steinberger discusses the use of so-called negative emission technologies in IPCC modeling. It is well known that these technologies that she refers to, including direct air capture, carbon storage, or massive tree planting, are extremely unlikely to ever be effective at sufficient scale to put even a dent in climate mitigation. Now, what the quote also shows that within the IPCC, it was difficult to challenge this and question whether the IPCC should actually include the imagined benefits of these non-existent technologies. This, in her view, would be seen as political, according to the IPCC, which is not allowed, while apparently serving the interests of powerful industries and states was somehow very easily perceived as neutral. Now, of course, as social movement activists have long recognized, neutrality in a context of inequality and injustice means that you side with power. And in our current situation, this means that you side with destruction and exploitation. The example shows the power of framing. Framing is inevitable because facts do not speak for themselves. There's always a frame. Frames define reality, they define problems, they define solutions, and they define what knowledge is relevant. However, and this is where the problems start, of course, not all frames are equal. We have massive inequities between worldviews and forms of knowledge, and this leads to certain frames gaining hegemony. And then what happens, particularly when you put science into the mix, is that dominant frames will cease to be seen as frames. They will start to appear to us as normal, as rational, as truth, as reality, and no longer as fact-value entanglements. And this makes them very hard to argue with, without being seen as irrational or indeed political, while it is very easy to present submission to powerful frames as neutral, as objective, and indeed as scientific. So, while working in a common frame is very comfortable for scientists as well as policymakers, it is also a situation of lock-in that I've called measurementality. This common frame, first of all, shapes policy priorities. For example, when the concept of ecosystem services was introduced in the biodiversity sphere, but you can also think about measures like carbon, perhaps currently nature-based solutions. Policies will want to develop policies to secure the supply of ecosystem services. And to do this, they need knowledge about how to secure those services, how to measure them, how to measure their effectiveness, and how to sustain them. So you have a feedback loop between research priorities and policy priorities that actually form a very effective science policy interface. And many scientists working in these frames are very happy to see that their knowledge is relevant and that it is used. We have to remember, of course, that this is also a submission to power that leads to the marginalization of alternative frames and alternative forms of knowledge. Now, as a consequence of these feedback loops and how difficult it is to challenge power, the role of science has basically been reduced to either the accountant of destruction, documenting as objectively as possible how bad things are, or the enabler of these stopgap solutions that powerful actors prefer. In both roles, science is not contributing to change. So the question emerges if and how science can go beyond reproducing the status quo, and whether, instead of only calling for transformative change, which they very often do, they can actually contribute to it. I want to believe that the answer to this question is yes. But my experiences have taught me that it's going to be very difficult. To help understand this, it's useful to recognize that the argument I'm making is not new at all. Since the 1970s, we have seen repeated calls to shift research priorities away from the natural physical sciences towards more of the social sciences, towards these more participatory and transdisciplinary approaches. We've seen a variety of different concepts that aim to capture these new approaches. But 50 years later, we have to conclude that these shifts have not happened. The approaches remain marginal and their effectiveness remains limited. So this raises the question why in 50 years, despite apparent support, we've made so little progress. So with Marianne Larsen, we have explored this question, and the conclusion we draw is that actually, just like powerful actors in society or politics and business, powerful actors in science protect their interests, and they actively obstruct these shifts. This is perhaps not surprising, but I continue to be disappointed when I see such thinly veiled power dynamics and abuses. Now, the inequalities that result from this should not be underestimated. They are massive. So these are just two examples of estimates of these inequalities. One of the papers has shown that out of all global climate research funding, 0.12% goes to the social sciences, and that includes economics. The other example shows that 95% out of all published articles, so it's a different metric, in agriculture are about industrial forms of agriculture, while alternative forms of agriculture, according to some other estimates, are responsible for about 70% of global food security. So these massive inequities explain why, despite good intentions, these new, more participatory or transdisciplinary approaches very often have disappointing results. On this slide, I try to depict what I see as a very common experience, where you may start with 5 people of different color but equal in size, and you end up with a very different situation. If you count, you will see we have 4 lefts. They've all become yellow. One of them is bigger, and it eats the others. Now, the reason that this happens is because there is very often this very dominant and unquestioned frame, a particular understanding of reality, the items it consists of, what the problem is, what knowledge is relevant, and how it can be integrated. And this frame polices what diversity can and cannot be tolerated. This results in either submission, if you are okay with assuming a place to fit in the puzzle, or exclusion, if you want to be the red one. In both cases, your voice is not very strong. So, arriving at my conclusion, it is clear that science itself is firmly and deeply implicated in all 3 of the underlying causes of the polycrisis. It relies on the same modernist worldview, it hoards and protects power, and it's an enabler and a reproducer of the status quo. So in order for science to contribute to transformation, it will need to transform. The question is, what could this possibly look like? Now, in view of the fundamental role of modernist values in science and the problems it produces, and the interrelations between modernity and coloniality, the transformation of science becomes a matter of decolonizing science. Now, there is a debate about whether science can actually be decolonized, because it is such a profoundly modernist and colonial institution, and whether abolishing is a better response. I really sympathize with that position. However, we're here. So looking at what is possible, I think we can think of the following. We need to challenge universal claims by science, by showing the values that are embedded in these claims and the inherent positionality and place-based character of where these claims come from. We can refuse research methods that are extractivist, that only take and do not give back. We can be deliberate about who we credit as an expert, who we cite and who we invite. We can work on alternative problem frames that are currently marginalized. And even better, I would say, we can actively support those people in society that are already working on these alternative options. And finally, we need to end the concentration of power in science and the dominant paradigm that perpetuates this concentration of power and keeps it in place. This is particularly important when this paradigm is intolerant, because it presents itself not as a paradigm, but as truth or reality, and because it believes that there can only be one of those. The question remains, of course, whether science is up for the task, or to use Audre Lorde's well-known expression, can we expect the master's tools to dismantle the master's house? Of course, we need to expect resistance, not only because power will protect power, but because these privileged scientists have very fragile egos. And this means that they will experience any argument for equality as oppressive. So it's going to be a struggle, and I hope you will join me. Thank you.